we've seen in many of our sports history lessons just how privileged the opportunities were for the upper and middle classes to participate and to attend public schools, right? So we know that these public schools from, well, I mean, they were existing well before the 1800s, but during the 1800s, they sort of boomed in popularity, right? And later in the century, they incorporated a full concept of athleticism, a full games program compulsory for all pupils. It was even extended to girls. I say that sort of ironically, by the way, not that girls should have been excluded, but they were traditionally. And even these kind of traditional views, it was sort of seen as so important that, gradually it was introduced to privileged girls as well. And we even found that by 1870, there started to be a belief that all children should be educated. It was happening in some other countries in Europe. Notably, one of the earliest ones was a country called Prussia, which doesn't really exist anymore, but it was part of Germany. And we followed their model. In 1870, the UK government passed what was called the Forster Education Act. The Forster Education Act. And this act basically meant that it was compulsory for all children, I think it was up to the age of 12, if I remember correctly, to attend school during the week. And actually there was uproar. Parents were furious. How can we do this? How can we spare the time? How can we get our children there? How can we afford to get them to the school? All these kind of issues. These people were very, very busy working people, working ridiculously long hours. And it wasn't a particularly popular move, I have to say. But in time, this kind of provision grew and grew and grew. And where we're going to kind of pick it up from is in 1902, because in 1902, even though there'd already been lots of sort of physical training within this compulsory school education, particularly what we might loosely call European gymnastics, which was a gymnastic style that had been popularised in countries like Germany and Denmark and Sweden. The schools incorporated this European gymnastics style as sort of like the PE thing in the early days, from 1870 until about 1900. But something happened at the turn of the 20th century. So Great Britain took part in a war. Well, actually, I mean, it was kind of a war. It was also kind of an invasion. And we took part in something called the Boer War, which was we were occupying South Africa, or the southern tip of Africa at this point, and the British Army in large numbers was basically decimated by a group of what we know today we call militant or kind of guerrilla fighters, who really maimed and killed a lot of British fighters. And the thing that was sort of blamed for that defeat, was the fitness of the working classes. The working classes were the people who were like the army fodder, right? They were the people that stood in front of the bullets and got in the way. So that it was the fitness of the working class which was blamed for this defeat. And the schooling that had been sort of established by this Forced Education Act in 1870, and by the way, when I say public school arrow here, it doesn't mean that these were public schools. They were public in another sense. They were state schools, right? So we're talking about state education here. But anyway, it was the fitness of the working classes that were blamed for this military embarrassment, humiliation in southern Africa. And as a result, the school system was seen as a way of actually improving this. And European gymnastics basically was thought, well, that thing didn't work. It didn't make them healthy. It didn't make them strong. It didn't make them fit. And it's thought that in this Boer War, over 1/3 of the recruits were turned away. 1/3 of people who wanted to sign up were told no because they were too unfit, and that apparently limited sort of the fighting prowess. So as a result of that, a new sort of curriculum for physical training was introduced in 1902, and it was called the Model Course. And I think there's a couple of sort of basis things that we need to understand. This model course, and by the way, the images I've got here which resemble the model course, they're sort of like the model course, but they're hard to find pictures of this sort of thing. So I'll explain their meaning in a second. But first of all, this model course was not written by a group of educators. This model course was written by a group of people called the War Office. The War Office. Now, if I'm not a big fan of offices at any time of day, really, but I definitely wouldn't be too keen on a war office. But it was written by a war office, so obviously a group of people who were interested in military fitness. It kind of goes without saying, doesn't it? They were interested in military fitness. And the person who was perhaps most significant within this war office that actually went on to write this model course was a guy called Colonel Fox, and I've tried everywhere to find a photograph of this guy, and I just can't find one of him. I imagine him with a really impressive moustache, though. That's what I've got in my mind. I think, military guy, colonel, moustache. So this guy, Colonel Fox, wrote this model course, this curriculum, I suppose equivalent to what today we'd call national curriculum, and he wrote it, and it went national and live in 1902. So literally the Boer War, if I remember rightly, finished in 1901. So a year after the Boer War, this curriculum went live. So what was it all about? Well, the first and central feature of this curriculum, you see it in this image here. This isn't actually of the Boer War. Sorry, this isn't actually of the model course, but it's of a group of soldiers kind of attacking something in their training. The whole idea of the 1902 model course, I'll link it down from here, was to develop military fitness in children. Now just think about that as a concept. Imagine you were going to school and the objective of your schooling was to make you fitter so that you could join the army. I'm not saying it doesn't do that for anyone, modern schooling, but for most it doesn't. But that's what it was all about at this particular time. So when we say that it was based around military fitness, think about some of the things that they might have done. You might therefore not be surprised to know that a significant aspect of this 1902 curriculum was marching. Children were made to march in ranks, in file, to actually develop this kind of obedience and discipline that was expected. In fact, let's actually write that word down, obedience. They were expected to be obedient. So obedience was certainly one of the objectives of this particular method. Other aspects of military fitness, it wasn't just sort of like a health fitness they were looking for, they were looking for readiness as well. So they also did things called dummy arms drills. Dummy arms drills. So that is kind of like reenacting things like attacks and so on with what we'd call today staves. Staves are like big sticks that they pretended were like rifles and weapons. So they use these dummy arms drills and use these staves to reenact the idea of war. So it's a really different model to what we've got now, right? There weren't teachers teaching this thing, so we just note this down. So they weren't teachers. Instead, they had something called NCOs. NCOs, not teachers. So they weren't educators doing this thing. They were NCOs. Now, just so you know, an NCO is a non-commissioned officer. So basically someone from the army, right? So someone from the army was fulfilling part of their army role by going into a school and saying, right, I'm going to take your military drill. We're going to deliver this thing and you're going to do exactly what I say. And that exactly what I say bit's really important because we would describe that as what we would call the command response style. So it was done in a style of command response. So there was no individuality, there was no creativity, there was no cognitive skill development, there was no social skill development. It was literally, you do as I say, and you do it when I say it, how I say it. So this isn't like today where we interpret movement skills and we try and learn to be more skillful and we try and cooperate with others and socialise and all these kind of things. No, this was literally, you do what I tell you to do, and if you don't, presumably you were on the end of a beating or whatever. So we'd also say, because it was command response, we'd also say that the curriculum was like centralised. And what we mean by that is it's centralised around this person, the NCO. That person makes all of the decisions. That person makes all of the guidance. That person makes all of the kind of the planning decisions and the cognitive aspects are all done by that person. That person as well is not going to have been famed for their kind of awareness and cognitive skills, right? They're going to have been a soldier, someone who's been made to think and told to think in a particular way. So they're going to all act in a particular way as well. I'm sure you can imagine what that sort of experience was like. You've got to remember as well, at schools in this time, there was very little space. So some schools might have a yard. Okay, so some schools might have a schoolyard, or others had to do it behind desks. Okay, so this was like not actually catered for. You did it because you had to do it, but if you didn't have any facility, you just did it inside and you just did it behind the school desk. So there's no specialist facilities. It was very, very basic, and you literally were doing it on the spot. But look, rightly, let me just drag this down slightly. Rightly, this curriculum was not respected. Okay, so it was not thought highly of. It was not respected. That's really important. And we also need to establish that it was quickly replaced. Okay, so it was quickly replaced. And we're going to have a look at some of the things that replaced the model course in the very next recording I'm going to do. But we're going to kind of jump ahead 30 years and look at 1933. This was replaced within a couple of years, and there were curriculums that replaced it very quickly. It still had some of the residue of this in it, but it was actually quickly replaced. And some of the reasons it was quickly replaced is it was deemed to be harsh. And you can understand that, right? It's like a kind of nasty experience being shouted at and told what to do. Attention, stand at ease, march left. All this sort of stuff, right? It was not thought to be good for children. It certainly was not educational. So we can certainly say it was not educational. Whether it made the children fitter for the military, I don't really know. I mean, I suppose the fact that they were doing this regularly and everyone was doing that, I suppose theoretically speaking, it would have been somehow effective, right? But also we've got to think, things like we said earlier, that it was been done for obedience. Is that part of a childhood? I mean, today we'd say, you got to do what you're told, but the objective of life isn't to be obedient. I don't think, is it? Or what would your view on that be? But at this time, this curriculum was all about obedience. It was making people think and do in a certain way, and that really kind of characterises the model course. I just want to introduce you to a couple of terms that you might see appearing in your exam question on this topic. I'm going to put 3 of them down here for you. We often get asked to describe either the objectives, or we might be asked to describe the content, or we might be asked to describe the methodology. Okay, so I wonder if we just ever so quickly just put what we've written into these subcategories. So what did we say the objectives were? Well, we know, right, it was military fitness. We know it was obedience and discipline. So we'll put those in. Let's just say obedience, but you could add discipline in there as well. And what about this one? Weapons handling, actually getting used to holding a weapon and attacking and defending with a weapon in your hand. So it's quite a staggering thing to be thinking about in school, really. Anyway, the content, of course, what we're talking about here is what they did. So we've got the idea of military drill. We could add into there things like marching. We could add into there things like dummy arms drills. Okay, and with this methodology, so we need to say kind of how it was done, right? So first of all, who did it? It was NCOs, we already know that, army folk. We already know that there were no facilities. Okay, so it might have been in the yard, it might have been behind the desk, and that it was compulsory. Okay, so all of these factors can kind of be broken down into these subdomains. Okay, so if you get asked a question specifically on objectives, specifically on content, specifically on methodology, then that's what it's referring to. So the ideas behind it, what they actually did, and how they did it is what we mean by methodology. Thanks for listening. Tune into the very next video when I'll be talking about 1933 curriculum of physical training. Thanks so much.